Before we read, I want to remind you that this is the day that we're asking everybody to turn in your stewardship card for 2013. This is Charlotte's and mine, and what we're going to do in just a moment is put this in the offering plate, and I invite you to do that as well. There should be some on every row, and I really want to ask you to do this. We're doing this as a church, as a discipline for 2013, to get us to think intentionally about how we use our money, our giving, and on from there in terms of the rest of our lives. So if you could put that in the collection plate, or if you want to put it in one of the bins outside these doors, that's fine, but that'd be very, very helpful if we could get that done. Thank you. Hebrews chapter 11. And I want to begin reading with verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land. Like a stranger in a foreign country, he lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundation, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children, because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. And therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he prepared a city for them. I'm going to focus in particular on one word and one idea in this text found in verse 9. By faith, he made his home in the promised land. It is, as Jim mentioned a moment ago, it is the Christmas season, and it is everywhere. There are Christmas trees everywhere. Everywhere you go, it seems like there are there's a Santa Claus figure. There are these pictures of trees and snow scenes, which always seems a little odd in Central Texas. And there are pictures like this one, and it just kind of looks Christmassy. And not to mention that this is the time of the year, or I should say not to neglect that this is the time of the year where people all over our world remember the birth of Jesus. I think around this time of the year, within many of us, that there is a longing to go home, wherever that is and whatever that looks like. There's a longing to be home, or a longing to go home. When I was growing up, every year our family traveled to Monticello, Arkansas. That's a picture of them in the red, Drew County, Arkansas. And my grandmother and granddad lived off Highway 4 going into Monticello. That's now 278. And they lived about 150 yards from the Monticello city limits sign. Lived right on the highway. And I loved going there on Christmas. It seemed like it was always cold and there was snow outside. And I just remember on Christmas Day, the big thing was that later on in the day, my cousins would come. And what a day that would be. And my grandmother had been cooking for days, and throughout the house you could smell all those, or what are to me all of those familiar smells, turkey and dressing and all sorts of pies and on and on and on. Down at the end of her living room in a corner next to the door no one ever used to go outside, and you weren't supposed to open that door, was the Christmas tree. And my memory of that time is good. I remember walking around that house in the cold and just playing in the snow with the cousins and running through that chicken coop and scaring all those chickens and hiding in the barn and on and on and on. 1987, my grandmother died in March of that year. My grandfather died in 1969. And Charlotte and I drove to Monticello for her funeral. And the day of her funeral, of course, we did what you would think. We were at the funeral home, as I recall, where her funeral was. We went to the cemetery and had this big lunch. And then we were going to go by my grandparents' house. And that day, I had this sense that I would probably never be there again. Not in that house, not on that property. And I remember walking around that house for a few minutes trying to take in everything. Looking at those giant sweet gum trees in the front and the ditches in the front where we used to play, try to get those trucks to do their horn. One last trip to her chicken coop and barn and around that house, and looked at my grandpa's old tractor that was still there. My cousin and her husband moved into that house shortly after that funeral. The house was sold. Today it has some older apartments on it. There is something in me that wants to go back to that place. That place. Christmas, for a lot of people, is a difficult time. Because it's time for which, for a lot of people, reminds them of who's not there. Of a husband who passed away, or wife who passed away, grandfather, grandmother. We're all around the table, but it's just not quite the same. It's a difficult time for some people who have just gone through a divorce, of trying to navigate those waters. And it's a difficult time because for some people, for some of you, you grew up in a home where there are not a lot of good memories. And Christmas kind of brings all of that out again for some people. And then you go to bed on Thursday night and you get up Friday morning. And somebody says something about something that happened in the Northeast, and you turn on the news and the unimaginable has happened. In fact, events so horrific, I'm not even going to go beyond what I'm saying right now to describe it. You just look at that and you think about that, and you can't take all of that in. You say, I know the world is broken, and I know there was this rupture at creation, and I know everything is upside down, but oh my goodness, I had no idea it was broken to that extent. How can things happen like that? You wonder, how do you go home again? How do you go back to a land where things are as they should be? How do you go back to a place where things look the way they should look? How do you go back to a time when things seemed better or you just somehow felt just right in that time? And it's not like when you're staring brokenness in the face. Turn to the back of your order of worship for a moment. And I want us to talk just for a few minutes about our longing to go home. Because not only is it something that I think resonates in our hearts at Christmas, but it's something that very much resonates in Scripture. Genesis 12:1. Remember this passage? The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I want you to leave. I want you to leave this place, and I want you to go to another. But I'm not telling you where we're going. You're going to wander." And boy, did they. My goodness, they wandered in that wilderness for years. And I just wonder how many times parents heard, "Are we almost there? Are we almost there? Are we almost there?" And for you to have to say, "I don't know, I don't know, I don't know." And finally they reached a promised land. And they planted their crops, and a nation arose, and they built towns and cities, and they forgot the God who brought them there. And they were exiled into Babylon, and they longed to go home. Back to Israel. Back to where their God's presence was at the temple. Back to the land. And they waited and waited and waited. That's our story. We ask, or some of us ask anyway, around Christmas, how can I find my way home again? How can I find my way home again? John Ortberg wrote a few years ago, "Some of you can't wait to get home. Some of you, when you go to be with your extended family over the holidays, can't wait because every single person around the table is a model of health and spiritual and emotional maturity." Right? And he says, for some of you that may be true, but not for much. No, you go home, and many of us have these conversations in the kitchen that go something like this. Why did he have to bring that woman? Just tell me why on Christmas Day he had to show up with that woman. Or conversations like, could we not have a little less drama from the aunt this year? Now, for a lot of us, Christmas is going home, but then we kind of realize, we're seated around the table with all kinds of normal, flawed people. Home is a place where you smile, but it's a place where you cry. Home is a place where you belong. It's a place where they take you in. It's a place where you realize that you have a place, or at least that's the way it should be. I know that's not the way it was for all of you. 6.5 million people every week watch Duck Dynasty. I saw a wonderful essay on this show not long ago. This was interesting. This guy was asking, why do so many people watch this program? I mean, all these people with beards and all this goofy humor, and they just kind of do all of that, and we're watching and we're laughing. And the person who wrote this essay said, I wonder if it's in part because of what happens at the end. When we're watching this family, funny as all get out, Cy with his cup and all kinds of people doing all these bizarre things, And no, it's not a hunting show, and it's not about ducks, and it's not even about duck calls. The essayist said, it's all about what happens at the end, where you realize they're family, and they love each other, and they love the Lord. There's something in us that wants to believe that's possible. Well, sometimes we feel like wanderers. Hebrews 11, verse 14, this writer talks about how people are forever looking for a country of their own. Looking for a country of their own. Lynn Anderson wrote a fine book, a friend of mine referred me to the other day again, entitled Longing for a Homeland. Longing for a Homeland. It is an excellent book. And basically, he writes about his own effort to go back to Canada and to show his children and where he grew up, and for them to see the old home place, and for him to get a sense of where his home was, and for his family too. At one point he writes, "We drove down through the gully past the old well and up toward the yard where my small boy feet used to run. But I was not prepared for what hit me when we pulled up in front of the old house. Weeds and grass waist high had taken over what had been Mother's well-kept yard, lined with shrubs and flowers. The outbuildings had all crumbled into the past. But the old house still stood, alone, her features weathered by time and vacancy, yet her personality and character still intact. But she looked so forlorn. Remnants of the brick chimney leaned off angle, about to tumble through a gap where the winds of 50 winters had wiggled shingles loose. Pigeons fluttered out of these holes in the roof. Partly broken windows stared blankly like the eyes of a lunatic gone mad with loneliness. For long moments I could only stand and stare back. Time seemed to fall away. I felt my bare feet running through the grass again. I heard my sisters laughing as young girls. I smelled Mom's cooking. I heard Dad's tenor song. An ache several levels deeper than physical pressed around my heart. I reeled under the storm of nostalgia. Then suddenly, like awakening from a dream, yesterday fell away, and my children tugged at my coat. "Daddy, why are you crying?" How could I explain to them that here in the very center of my childhood place, I felt anything but at home? So how do you go home again? How do we go home? Some people try to go home by thinking that somehow if we could just go back to a certain time. To a certain time. I mean, right now we live in present tense. Right now we live in the present, and we think, if I could just kind of go back to the past and kind of be there and see that. Yet the past moments that I remember, I don't know how to recreate those today. And some of us, as Lynn suggests in his book, we attempt to go back to the place. If I could just go back to the old home place and kind of go back there, then I would feel like I was home again. I grew up in southeast Dallas. Most of my life was spent at 1948 Alhambra. That neighborhood, that portion of southeast Dallas has changed dramatically from when I grew up. And that neighborhood has really changed. My parents moved away a long time ago, live in Mesquite now. And I remember some years ago we took our kids by the house where I grew up. And the street looked so different. It was rough. It's a rough area. But what I especially remember is driving in front of that house and looking at how small that house was. red brick, nondescript house, but as a little guy, it looked so big. The property looked so big. Maybe it was because I mowed, but the property looked so big. And the girls kind of looked at me with that, Dad, is this it? I mean, did you grow up in this kind of neighborhood, Dad? And I wanted them to see for just a moment what it was like to live there. I don't know how to do that, but I wanted them to see that. I wanted them to see on Sunday afternoons what it was like to run out of my house at the halftime of a Dallas Cowboys game and leap over the steps and to look up and down my street and see all kinds of boys and girls doing that same thing at halftime. And we're all out there with footballs. And we're doing play-by-play announcer. And we're calling, who we are. I mean, it starts from years ago with Cornell Green intercepts a pass, to Mel Renfro intercepts a pass, to Everson Walls intercepts a pass, and all the way through all of those wide receivers and various quarterbacks. And I wanted my kids to see this is a great place to live. This is a fun place to live. This is where people laugh. This is before crime. This is before all the mess. This was a great deal. And all they saw was their father telling them to lock their doors. In a street that looked old and used, pretty weathered. I don't know how to go back to a place and recreate that. Sometimes when we just say, if you could just go back and just have all the right people there, if only my children could know my grandparents and great-grandparents, and if only everybody that's so precious to my life and memory could all be together around a table another time. Maybe if you just had all the right people there, you could go home again. And finally, some of you would say, I have no desire to go back there. When I think about growing up, there's pain and humiliation, and it's dark. And I have no desire to see the people, the time, and the place. How do you find your home? I want to tell you, the Bible is helpful here. 2 Corinthians, turn there if you would, 2 Corinthians 5. This is really good news. We can have a home that never has to end. We can have a home that never has to end. We can have a home right now that never has to end. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6. Whoops. That's not where we need to be. Hold that for just a moment. We'll be back there in a minute. I goofed. Turn to Psalm 90. Psalm 90. Sorry about that. Psalm 90. This is verse 1, and you may want to underline this one. Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Do you hear that? Lord, you have been our throughout all generations. Sometimes we look at one another and we go, man, I wish I'd come from a home like you. You had a mother and daddy that were sane and people that loved you and y'all grew up in a white picket fence and all that. kind of thing, and we grew up in a different sort of era, listen. This is a promise from God, and nobody is in an advantage over you. Nobody. Look at the Bible again. Lord, you have been our dwelling place. You have been our home. Throughout all generations. And then there's this discussion of just how brief life is. And look at verse 12. You may want to underline this one. Teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Since we find our home with the Lord, and since life on this earth is so brief, let's think about making the most of our days that we might live with wisdom. Molded, our longing to be secure, our longing to be wanted. I don't care how grown up we get and how good we look on the outside. Inside we are children who want to be home. The good news this morning is that every single person can go home. I can find my home in the Lord, and He will be that dwelling place. And that's true for all generations. My father, my mother, me, you, my children, my grandchildren. It's true. It's true. If you make your home in God, in God's presence, then you can live the rest of your days with purpose. In 1946, that old classic, It's a Wonderful Life, was released. You remember this. It's shown every Christmas. And we watch it every Christmas. And it is the story of George Bailey, who's running this, as he says, broken down building and loan. And he's had to put all of his dreams on hold. And he's a dreamer. He's put dreams on hold for his brother, whom he rescued from the ice years ago. And now he's in trouble. And he wishes that he had never been born. And he's allowed to see for a few minutes what his community and life and what the life of his family members would have been like had he never been born. Well, it is a very disorienting time for him, and so he does what many of us would do. He goes back to his mama's house. Only he's never been born, and she doesn't know him. We're going to play 2 minutes of this. And just hear the storyline, if you would.
Mother. Mother, what do you want? Mother, this is George. I thought sure you'd remember me.
George who? If you're looking for a room, there's no vacancy.
Mother, listen, please help me. Something terrible's happened to me. I don't know what it is. Something's happened to everybody. Please let me come in and keep me here until I get over it.
Get over what? I don't take in strangers unless they're sent here by somebody I know.
What? Well, I know everybody you know. What, your brother-in-law, Uncle Billy.
You know him?
Well, sure I do.
When'd you see him last?
Today, over at his house.
It's a lie. He's been in the insane asylum ever since he lost his business. And if you ask me, that's where you belong.
Strange, isn't it? Each man's life touches so many other lives. And when he isn't around, he leaves an awful hole, doesn't he?
I've heard of things like this. You got me in some kind of a spell or something. Well, I'm going to get out of it. I'll get out of it. I know how, too. The last man I talked to before all this stuff started happening to me was Martini.
You know where he lives?
Well, sure I know where he lives. He lives in Bailey Park.
You sure this is Bailey Park?
No, I'm not sure of anything anymore. All I know is this should be Bailey Park. But where are the houses?
You weren't here to build them. Your brother, Harry Bailey, broke through the ice and was drowned at the age of 9.
That's a lie. Harry Bailey went to war. He got the Congressional Medal of Honor. He saved the lives of every man on that transport.
Every man on that transport died. Harry wasn't there to save them because you weren't there to save Harry. You see, George, you really had a wonderful life. Don't you see what a mistake it would be to throw it away?
I don't know where you live or where you plan to spend Christmas. You may be in an apartment or this big sprawling house or a simple frame house. Home is not the house you live in. Home is to live and make your place in the dwelling place of God. And when that happens, God uses you to make a difference in other people's lives. You could never imagine how lots of us would be if God hadn't used you at strategic times in our lives. Everybody can have a home. Home is making your home in the dwelling place of God, in the presence of God. Now, 2 Corinthians 5. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 6. Therefore we are always confident and know that as long as we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. For we live by faith and not by sight. We are confident, I say, and would prefer to be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So we make it our goal to please Him, whether we are at home in the body or away from it. See, there's a way to be home in my body. To be home, to be fully at home every day and to live in the presence of God. But that's not the extent of this. If you were to compare the two, he says it's really better by far to be at home, not just in the body, but with the Lord. You wonder, you just wonder, or I do, after a day like last Friday, how do you go home again? How do we as a culture, how do we as a nation, more importantly, how do we as a church go home again? I think one thing we do is, one, we live in the presence of God, like we talked about a while ago, and we wail and lament before our God, whose heart is broken as well. Second, we look to a day when there will be no more brokenness. when we will live in this new creation, the new heaven and the new earth, the dwelling place of God. You can read about this in Revelation 21, 22, where there will be no more night or pain or sorrow, but we will live complete and whole in the presence of God forever. Karen Zacharias wrote a little book a few years ago called "Will Jesus Buy Me a Double Wide?" She tells the story of growing up near Columbus, Georgia. She said after Daddy died, and her dad died in Vietnam, after Daddy died, Mama paid $6,000 for a single wide trailer. It was a 12 by 60. And it was the first home our family owned. It had plywood walls so thin you could hear a roach grunt. And the only insulation from the outside elements was a feather pillow clutched down over your head during winter, or a cooling rag filled with ice cubes for the sticky nights of a Georgia summer. We moved from that trailer park 5 times in 6 years. Cornered lots in the trailer parks were the most coveted because they usually had the biggest yards. Wealthy people lived in trailers with tip-outs, and the very rich, they lived in double-wides. My friend Karen Paris and her brother lived in a double-wide with their mama, and they really had it made, all that space for only 3 people. We had twice as many people living in a trailer half as big. While I no longer live in a house balanced on cinder blocks the way I did in my youth, I recognize that almost all of life's truly meaningful moments took place in that trailer. And she begins to describe some of the meaningful moments of her growing up years. She says, given my druthers, I'd rather reside in a mansion carved from marble than a 12 by 60 crafted from aluminum siding. Still, I know without question that God's love for me or His favor toward me is not manifested in whether I live at the end of a dirt road in a trailer or around the Emerald Bend in a gated community composed of McMansions. Proof of God's love is not found in the square footage of our homes or the number of cars our garage will hold. God's love is not evident in our net worth at all. It's found in the same place it has always been, at the foot of a rough-hewn and bloodied cross. Our God invites us home. We remember this time of the year that our God wanted us to come home so badly that He was willing to send His own Son to be born in a barn and in a feeding trough. Our God has a home available for every one of us, now and beyond. Now, to live in the presence of God, the dwelling place of God. It's yours. It's mine. And when I live in the dwelling place of God, and I go through wonderful, happy times, I just thank God for that. When I live in the dwelling place of God and my heart or your heart is broken, I know where I go home to. And I know to whom I go. But our eyes look this way to a day when we no longer live in brokenness, but we live in the presence of the Lord forever. How about that? Let's sing for a moment. And I encourage you, make your home with the Lord. If you'd like to visit about that later, I'd be glad to visit with you. If you'd like to pray with our elders about that now, some of them will be at the back. Why don't we sing, Jim?
Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in His wonder.